It's not, you're not doing it. Oh, sorry. For those who are in the room, we're going to be starting in about 5 minutes. Also to those who are online, welcome. Please grab some snacks and please make yourself comfortable. We want to encourage people to come up closer to the front if you can. Yeah, the bathrooms are around the corner. So we'll start in about 5 minutes. Maybe we can go back and somehow like consistent so you get code and then direct. Start in the chair, 15 minutes in, or either moderating alone. Raven should be there. Check for freedoms. There to help. You told me that there was a behind. Okay, but were they having problems or just in line? The security. Oh, that's the event coordinator on the guest list. Take it away. Yeah. Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for all of those who are here in person and for those who are here online. Greetings. Thank you for starting your day with us. We hope this will be a really rich and interactive conversation. Please help yourself to some coffee, some treats, and you can sit wherever you want. As I mentioned, we're hoping that this food and this conversation will be nourishing and an energizing boost for what you need for the midweek CSW slump. So Hopefully this will be a reinvigorating experience for you. My name is Coco Jervis. I am the Director of Programs at Mama Cash. I'll be your moderator for today. For those who are unfamiliar, Mama Cash is one of the world's oldest international women's funds. We're based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and we provide flexible core long-term grants to self-led women, girls, trans, and intersex rights organizations and activists worldwide. I want to make a quick plug because between now and the end of the month, our Resilience Fund, which is our biggest fund, is accepting applications. So please go check it out online at mamacash.org, spread the word, or come talk to me or some of the other Mama Cash staff members if you have any questions. So this event is organized by GAGA, so the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action. GAGA, I'm sure most of you know, rallies the collective action and power of women's rights, environmental, and climate justice movements around the world, supporting a powerful network of about 1,850 community-based organizations in 44 countries, strengthening gender justice climate solutions. This event is also co-organized by the Equality Fund, who sustainably resources women's rights organizations and feminist movements, as well as FCDO, which is the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, who is advancing the work of both GAGA and the Equality Fund on the intersection of gender, conflict, and climate. So a few housekeeping items before we begin. The bathrooms are down the hall to the right. This session will be about an hour and 45 minutes up until 11:15 a.m. Eastern Time. I'll try to be a strict timekeeper because we have such a full agenda. We hope to get through all of it. We have in-person and live and virtual participants. I think there's around, how many people online? Around 35 people online. There will be Portuguese and French interpretation for some of our online attendees. This event is being recorded and will be shared on YouTube. Most of the recording will feature just the speakers, but if you have any questions or concerns about the recording, please come and speak to Naomi over here in blue or to me. If you're posting on social media, please tag us, of course. And the outcomes of this discussion that we will have later in the program or interactive discussion will be featured in an article in the Alliance magazine in April, which you will all receive. So a huge thank you to the International Rescue Committee for having us here and being hosts, and for the organizers, and for all the panelists for sharing their insights, and for all of you for being here. Thank you so much. So let's dive in. So the topic of today's session, as you know, is conflict, gender, and the climate nexus, local realities and policy solutions. Around the world, women-led efforts for peace, gender, and environmental justice, from the Philippines to Mozambique, Burkina Faso to Brazil, face a dangerous convergence of violence, environmental destruction, and extractivist land grabs. As corporate interests, state forces, and armed actors expand into the territories, entire communities are displaced, criminalized, or violently repressed. Meanwhile, worsening climate disasters intensify food insecurity, water shortages, forced migration, and gender inequalities. Yet these women are not just victims, they're leaders, they're mobilizers, and they're defenders. They reclaim their land, preserve indigenous and traditional knowledge, resist militarization, and develop innovative climate adaptive strategies. Through grassroots organizing, legal advocacy, education, and direct action, they challenge systemic injustices while strengthening their communities. Discussions on gender, conflict, and climate nexus often remain overly academic, detached from the lived experiences of those most affected. Today, we're going to shift this perspective to women's environmental human rights defenders and those at the front lines, women, intersex, non-binary, and trans people worldwide. Their stories reveal that gender, conflict, and climate change are not isolated crises, but deeply interconnected, reinforcing systems of oppression while also creating spaces for radical resistance. A quick note about the run of show today. We're going to have the session be in 3 parts, We'll begin with a few key insights from two groundbreaking research initiatives. First, the Equality Fund Hillary will present findings from Unfolding the Tapestry, weaving themes and strategies of feminist crisis response and offering a broad analysis of feminist responses to crises. This will be followed by insights from Naomi from Women at the Intersection of Gender, Conflict, and Climate, a study led by the Women Environmental Human Rights Defenders and supported by Gaga, which would delve into the lived realities of those navigating those overlapping crises. Then we are building on this foundation, we're going to have a panel discussion and expert perspectives online. Some of the panelists will be online, some will be here, and they'll be shedding light on some of the challenges faced and the solutions being forged at the intersection of gender, conflict, and climate. And third, in the final part, we're going to have an interactive session. We're going to turn what we are talking about into sort of actionable strategies. We're going to break that into little groups for interactive discussions, reflecting collectively on the issues raised and explore concrete ways to better support women's rights organizations working on these complex and human and high-risk environments. We're then going to share back, combine notes, and close the session for today. So without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Hillary. Please briefly introduce yourself, and then afterwards, Naomi, for their presentations.
Thank you, Coco. Welcome, everyone. My name is Hillary Clausen. I'm Senior Policy Advisor with the Equality Fund and thrilled to be partnering with Gaga and FCDO on this event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land currently and colonially known as New York City is the homeland of the Lenape, who were violently displaced as a result of settler colonialism. The Equality Fund works in relationship with Indigenous organizations to resource their work abundantly and use our global platforms to learn from, amplify, and support Indigenous leadership. The Equality Fund sustainably resources women's rights organizations and feminist movements through global grant-making, feminist philanthropy, policy advocacy, and gender lens investing. To begin today's discussion on the conflict-gender-climate nexus, I'll share highlights from our research on feminist response to crisis, including both political and environmental and beyond, which we commissioned to inform our feminist humanitarian grant-making. This research aims to contribute to filling a gap in the humanitarian literature by centering the perspectives of Global South feminist activists, both under-acknowledged and under-resourced in the humanitarian ecosystem. The research begins by framing crisis from a feminist perspective. Crises are structural, meaning there are complex histories and interconnected causes behind them. For example, under colonialism and capitalism, the plundering of indigenous land and destruction of ecosystems. Crises are compounded, so they intensify pre-existing vulnerabilities and exclusions, leading to a need to understand local context, including specific patterns of oppression and exploitation. And they're political. So those who hold power determine what a crisis is and the resources and attention that they get. The research then defines feminist responders, in part in contrast to traditional crisis responders, who are external actors with limited local knowledge and presence, who specialize in crisis intervention and are comparatively better resourced than feminist responders. In contrast, feminist responders are grassroots feminist activists who have spent decades advocating for women's rights and LGBTQI+ rights in their communities. When crisis hits, they transition from regular activities to crisis response. Unfortunately, they're often under-resourced and largely ignored. But even in crisis response, feminists take a multi-sectoral, community-centered, long-term, and care-centered approach. Meaning, in general, a feminist crisis response addresses systemic issues perpetuating the crisis beyond surface-level aid. It supports communities to regenerate and respawn. It addresses immediate needs and overarching long-term dynamics simultaneously, and it recognizes care as an antidote to violence. The research concludes by outlining the roles of feminist funds in crisis contexts, from engaging feminist crisis responders as key actors to providing both responsive and long-term funding for not only conventional humanitarian aid, but also emergency livelihoods and relocation, care and healing work, advocacy and campaigns, skills building, and knowledge and documentation. And finally, feminist funds contribute to a robust feminist crisis response infrastructure, including funding, preparedness and alert systems, advocacy, coordination with the feminist funding ecosystem, and knowledge sharing. Thank you, and very interested to hear from Gaga's research, as well as from our esteemed panelists and all of you in our discussion.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for starting us off. Hello, everyone. Very nice to see you all in such a full room. I'm Noemi Grützer, the Alliance Coordinator of the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action. As Coco said very rightly before, the gender conflict and climate nexus is really often analyzed through academic debates, policy frameworks, which actually do completely fail to take into account the multi-dimensional lived realities of the women at the forefront of this nexus and the ones most affected. So Gaga decided to actually work on a research supported by FCDO with the title Women at the Intersection of Gender, Climate and Conflict, to actually shift this perspective and conceptualize the nexus through the eyes of the women from across the globe who have experienced and are experiencing its impacts firsthand. And their stories really reveal that gender, conflict, and climate change are not separate crises. They are deeply entangled, reinforcing systems of oppression, while also generating spaces for radical resistance. And the research we're carrying out is a research in Burkina Faso, Brazil, the DRC, Mozambique, Nigeria, and the Philippines. And most importantly, it's led by women environmental human rights defenders and women-led community-based organizations themselves by using feminist participatory research methodology. It really aims to document and amplify the solutions, the strategies, the approaches, and best practices currently being implemented by women environmental human rights defenders and community-based organizations led by women, trans, non-binary, and inter-people. The preliminary findings you can find in this brochure, which is lying there, is just the beginning. We're working on a full report, which will include a cross-country analysis and policy recommendations, and it will be ready end of March, so you can sign up and put your email there if you want to be the first ones getting this report to you. As said, the research will provide policy recommendations from affected communities to really guide bilateral and philanthropic donors in meaningfully resourcing and supporting these groups. And we also want to contribute to a more diverse and localized understanding of conflict and really enhance global discussions and promote inclusive and transformative policy responses. Some of the key findings I want to quickly mention, and importantly, the research shows that at the core of this nexus is actually the story of land. The land that sustains communities, the land that is stolen for corporate profit, and the land that women fight to reclaim. Control over land and livelihoods is central to women's resistance against conflict, climate change, and extractivism. Women are fighting for ancestral lands, food security, and autonomy while resisting land grabs, intimidation, and forced displacement, often driven by oil and mining companies, agribusinesses, and state-backed interests. Conflict and militarization serve as enforcers of dispossession, using violence to suppress resistance. And climate change acts as the compounding force, deepening inequalities by making food and water security even more precarious. And yet, in the midst of these crises, women are leading the way, rebuilding, organizing, and demanding justice. And some of the best practices we're capturing and documenting in this research are community-based land defense, training women to lead land councils, women's economic cooperatives, alternative and inclusive education practices, sustainable women-led land management, such as advancing gender just agroecology, reforestation, then the building of networks of resistance, supporting solidarity across movements to challenge militarization, and last but definitely not least, the importance of flexible core funding. And we're showing how Gaga is supporting these groups with long-term core funding, which is really enabling them to sustain advocacy, to adapt to crises, and to strengthen land, climate, and gender justice efforts. And the research really shows their resistance is not only about survival, it is also about survival, but it is about reimagining a world where land, life, and justice are defended by those who have been always its fiercest protectors. And I'm very happy to hear today on the panel from two women environmental human rights defenders, Zenabou and Berta, who were leading the research in their contexts and who will tell us more about the insights and outcomes of this. And with this, back to you, Coco.
Thank you so much, Naomi and Hillary, for that brief update. I can see online that folks are asking questions about the report, or is it available online already? Great. Okay, great. So folks can get it online. Okay, we're going to move in. Can folks hear me? Okay, we're going to move into our panel discussion. We have 5 panelists here today. 2 are virtual and 3 are here online. We are going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. There will be 2 questions. One of the questions everybody will answer, and the second will be a specific question for them. So I will start with someone online. We're going to start with our women's human rights defender online, Berta Rafael, who is our Gaga partner from Mozambique. Berta, can you hear me?
Sim, estou a ouvir.
Yep, I can hear you.
Great. Okay, so this is your question. Everybody is going to have 5 minutes to respond. Berta, your question is, welcome. Can you share your perspective on the conflict, gender, and climate nexus in the context of which you live and work? And secondly, one of the key findings from the case study you led in collaboration with Gaga highlights the importance of alternative education and political awareness building. In Mozambique, for example, the land governance and climate adaptation programs you're implementing are empowering women to challenge inequality and adapt to climate change. Can you tell us more about this work and its impact?
Muito obrigada.
Yes.
Espero que estejam a me ouvir.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay.
Berta Rafael, do
I'm
Centro
Berta
Terra
Rafael
Viva em Moçambique, uma
from the
organização não
Living
governamental
Land Association in Mozambique. It's an NGO in Mozambique, and we work on environmental advocacy, studies, research, and like. We took part in this study, or we carried out this study, and explained our methodology. What we tried to do was understand how people who don't necessarily have access to school, who can't read, who don't really have access to information, can still create mechanisms to get this information so that this knowledge is in the hands of people who work the land, who need this information and need access to natural resources. And the reason is we notice that there's this nexus between conflict, gender, and climate. With the Gaga project, we identified an initiative where we trained women at the community level. These are women with no formal schooling, but they're communicative, they're community-based, and we trained them and explained to them what their rights were, the laws that the rights that they have in the different laws. This is environmental laws and all sorts of laws that we have. So they needed to understand their rights. Right, the right to respect, the right to their having their rights respected. This is a very resource-rich country. So sadly, there's a lot of exploitation as well as investment, and this takes up a lot of the space. And this is space that should be occupied by the communities. When the communities aren't aware of what their rights are and what these spaces encompass, they're often relocated, removed from their original lands. And there's no way for them to reduce vulnerability. So we educate women, we give them the knowledge of what their rights are, understanding what are the practices available to them for use of natural resources. We explain to them climate change and what is happening, and they need to understand how to adapt to climate change in their profession and in their personal lives. And this nexus, therefore, is very interesting. So once they understand what's going on, once they understand their rights, once they understand what they can do, they can take part in movements to advocate for their rights, to defend their rights. They can take part in decision-making activities, making important decisions for the community. For example, when investors come in, they're prepared to negotiate, to understand, and to know everything available to them to set up a true partnership or other activity. So women now have a space to work, carry out their activities. They have lands for their house, for their houses, they're able to say what can be done with their lands and not with their lands, what they can do in the face of climate change, and they will find peace, tranquility. And working with these community women has been incredible. When we look at the culture where often women weren't allowed to go to schools or even allowed to speak in public, they were often overshadowed by the men in their lives, and including authorities. So this has really changed everything that's happened. Women now having space to speak builds trust, establishes a setting where women can communicate among themselves, and establish strategies without fear of government, family pushing back. Sometimes when they often feel like they can't speak because their husbands are there, but now that's not the case. They can now analyze and look at the laws in effect. They can understand if the laws speak to them, if they're fair, if they fit with their needs. So they can then identify gaps, actions that can be taken, and these women can also convey to us what access they need. We have access to other levels of communication, and they can come to us. We can access the government or the private sector. So we noticed this nexus, and the most important thing is education, environmental education, access to information in such a way that there's a true, calm, flowing interconnection to promote sustainable development. I think I'll stop here, and I will obviously answer more questions moving forward. I'm here to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Berta. I think that there was applauses for you. Thank you. I think it's such a wonderful, concrete example of how building a movement is happening from the ground up, and such great examples also of political education component in a participatory way. So thank you so much for sharing your example. We're going to move on to Zeina. Who's in the room? Oh, yes, panelists, come on up. Welcome. We have additional panelists who will be joining us soon, but for now, Zeina, I'm going to hand over the mic to you. Zeina is the director, my apologies, of the Doria Feminist Fund. I'll let you introduce yourself and answer this question. How would you characterize the conflict, gender, and climate nexus in the context in which you live and work? And also, secondarily, how does the Doria Foundation support women's rights organizations and the feminist movements working at this intersection? And what challenges do you face? And how does a feminist fund like yours overcome these obstacles?
Hi, thank you, Coco. Hello, everyone. So I'm Zeina. I'm the executive director of the Doria Feminist Fund, a feminist fund that's founded, led by, and serving feminist movements across the Middle East and North Africa region. The Doria Feminist Fund is currently operating in one of the most challenging contexts globally. Ongoing compounded crisis across several countries in the region, protracted crisis, escalation of violence, floods, natural disasters, bearing the repercussions of climate change. The MENA region actually faces water scarcity, and by 2050, it's expected that most of the regions will be facing extreme water stress. The recent wars have led to displacements, and the climate-induced floods and earthquakes have left hundreds, actually millions, without homes, without means of income, and has placed additional burdens on women responsible for household welfare. In the MENA, the female to male ratio of unpaid care work is 4.7. It's the highest in the world. And we all know that during crisis, the burden of the unpaid care work increases exponentially, and the capitalist, hegemonic, patriarchal systems expect this resource to be infinite, similar to the natural resources. So actually women's time and women's potential is being exploited by being fully immersed with the unpaid care work. This is actually reflected in the low participation in the labor force. Also, the MENA has one of the lowest women's participation in the labor force. In the region, we have discriminatory legal frameworks. Women only owned 4.5% of the agricultural land, so they're basically the seasonal workers. They account to 70% of the seasonal workers that work under precarious working conditions, but they don't own the land that they work in. There's also weak law enforcement related to protection from GBV, and one of the lowest rates of women's participation in the decision-making spheres at the local and at the national levels. The feminist movements in the region are operating in this volatile environment that's constantly witnessing shrinking civic space, escalated threats, while receiving minimal resources, because the region is one that receives the minimal amount of human rights funding. The interlinkages between conflict, climate, and gender haven't been fully explored in the region, and one of the main reasons for this is due to the lack of funding, which disables the production of homegrown knowledge. There isn't enough trust in the local expertise, so this interlinkages hasn't been fully explored. And also because there is no cross-linkages, cross-movement building. So every movement is working in silos. There's the social justice movement and there's the climate justice movements, and there haven't been enough efforts to actually build the bridges between those movements. The Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans, there have been. For Resolution 1325, most of the countries have developed national action plans, but those national action plans don't address climate-induced tensions. And the environmental plans, on the other hand, they are not gender responsive. And women are underrepresented on the decision-making tables on both the peace-building tracks and the climate justice tracks. Conflicts such as crisis such as conflict and climate crisis have differential impact on women, as everyone has shared earlier. And in the region particularly, we have groups that face increased vulnerabilities during crisis, LGBTQI+ communities who will be not allowed, for instance, to access collective shelters or services, migrant domestic workers who are not included in these systems. There's also the disabled groups. And as my colleague from Gaga has shared, women step up to respond to these needs of the vulnerable groups with minimal resources they have. GFF, the Doria Feminist Fund, is supporting feminist groups working at grassroots level, radical and apologetic groups who are fighting for peace, climate, and social justice. We are supporting groups working on food security and ecofeminism in war-affected regions in Lebanon, groups working on recycling and dyeing clothes, preserving heritage, and cultivating a community that preserves plants, land, and people's stories. Young feminist group that's breaking the social norms in war-torn Syria and combating restrictions on mobility while embracing an eco-friendly transportation option through advocating for a culture of girls riding bikes, which isn't actually the norm in Syria. It's a taboo for a girl to ride a bike. In Iraq, there's a group that's working on the linkages between SRHR and pollution after years of war and natural resources exploitation. Groups that are advocating for women's representation in peace-building efforts and encompassing a broad definition of crisis, which includes climate crisis. This is really important. How do we define a crisis? Feminist collectives in the region are leading crucial response efforts. They are working to address the immediate humanitarian needs while maintaining a focus on the long-term structural changes needed to build resilience and equality. At Doria, we are offering flexible support to women-led groups across the region through a participatory grant-making approach, realizing the importance of creating and investing in activist advisory committees during crisis, those ones that are actually on the ground, direct contact with the communities who are well aware of the needs and the responses that needs to be adopted. Doria's emergency response grants to feminist activists in the region not only seek to respond to the immediate needs of the communities in crisis, so it's not just a humanitarian aid, but also plays a significant role in enabling and ensuring the sustainability of feminist grassroots movements and co-creating the community infrastructures that's needed to collectively heal and build. The intersection of climate change, gender, and conflict remains underfunded and under-resourced. By providing funding, research support, advocacy platforms, and capacity building, we at Doria are working to ensure the feminist movements have the resources, the visibility, and the influence that they need to drive climate justice and conflict resilience. We are offering opportunities for grantee partners to convene, connect, co-conspire, and access psychological support, much needed social support during ongoing crisis in an effort to effectively and meaningfully contribute to their psychological and physical well-being to enable them to sustain their activism and the fight towards a more just society and a sustainable planet. I would like to note, before I conclude, that we've been receiving more and more applications from feminist groups who are working on the intersection of gender and climate. And this speaks a lot to the increased awareness and knowledge on this issue. And soon we're going to be opening a call that's specifically earmarked for climate and gender justice.
Thank you so much for making it so clear the important work that the Doria's Feminist Fund is doing to support
Yes, good
groups
girl, Gigi.
that are facing
Yes.
humanitarian crisis and polycrises, working with stigmatized groups. And thank you also for that plug about the upcoming call that you were having. So we're going to move on to someone who's going to be speaking to us virtually. Zenabou, you there?
Bonjour tout le monde.
Hi, welcome. Zenabou is
Hello,
our
everyone.
Gaga partner from Burkina Faso. I have a question for you. Good morning. Good afternoon. How would you characterize the conflict, gender, climate nexus in the context in which you live and work? And also, one of the key findings from the cross-country analysis and case studies you led in coordination with Gaga is the critical role of reclaiming land and livelihoods. Control over land and resources is central to women's resistance against conflict, climate change, and extractivism. Could you share more about this and the key insights from your research?
Merci beaucoup, Madame la modératrice.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I am Zenabou Benedict. I am the chairperson of Women Environmental Program in Burkina Faso. Well, very quickly, let me introduce Burkina Faso. That is a Sahel country, as you well know, a country, a remote country with no access to the sea, with an impact of climate change. With 80%, the economy is based on agriculture. So in terms of the impact of climate change, regularly we can see flood and drought.
Qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire donc de ce
So
nexus
what can we say about this nexus?
conflit, genre et climat dans le
The
contexte
gender, conflict, and climate
Je dois dire que
nexus
c'est
in the
vraiment
Burkina Faso
une
context?
triple
Well,
vulnérabilité
it's a triple
pour la femme.
vulnerability, and especially for
L'impact
women.
des changements
The
climatiques
impact of climate change
entraîne une faible ou
gives way
capacité, une
to
très
a
faible
weak capacity or a weak capacity of
de
adaptation
tout le monde, et surtout principalement des femmes qui sont
to
dans
everybody, and
l'agriculture.
especially
Nous
women in
savons que les
agriculture.
femmes
And we
sont
all
celles qui
know
sont
that
le plus
women are the
dans les
ones
champs, dans
that
l'agriculture,
are
qui sont en train de
in
produire.
plantation,
Il y a
and
également
they are the ones
l'effet
producing.
pervers
And
des inégalités
the
de genre sont
negative
présentes. Donc, un
effects
deuxième
of
élément donc qui complexifie
inequalities
ce nexus.
is
Troisième
an
élément donc,
element
de
that
vulnérabilité,
exacerbates this
les
nexus.
conflits
And the
liés
third
aux
level of
ressources
vulnerability is the
laissent donc justement de la
resource-induced
rareté
conflict
et des ressources et qui
because
traversent
of
effectivement
the
de notre situation de contexte
rare
sahélienne, mais
nature
également des
of
changements
resources. And
climatiques
our
et d'où est les
Sahel
sécheresses.
country
Cela donc
and the
il y
drought,
a
all of
également
that exacerbate the
l'extrême
situation.
pauvreté.
So, and there's also
Qui,
extreme
au-delà
poverty.
donc de la rareté des ressources, nous avons
Beyond
l'extrême pauvreté, surtout
the
en
rare
milieu
nature of
rural,
resources, we
et
also have
cela
extreme poverty,
entraîne
especially in
une
rural
autre
areas. And
vulnérabilité,
all of these
surtout
creates another
liée aux personnes
vulnerability.
autour des femmes,
And this is
notamment
in
les
relation
jeunes
to the
femmes
people
et les femmes
around the women,
qui
that is
se
the
font
youth and
donc
also the men,
enrôler dans,
who are
par des
now
sponsors
enrolled
des conflits, au-delà même des
by
conflits entre
conflict sponsors.
agriculteurs
And
et
even beyond
éleveurs.
the agricultural
Voilà deux
conflict,
types de conflits
there are other
que nous
types
vivons au
of
Burkina
conflict
Faso,
that we
qui
can
est
see in
ici.
Burkina
Et
Faso.
donc, le
And
changement climatique avec ses
climate
impacts sur
change
le terrain
with the
et qui est
impacts on the
la
field,
rareté des ressources et la
the rare
pauvreté qui
nature
s'installe
of resources and the
entraîne
extreme
que ces
poverty,
jeunes et ces hommes
all of
se font
that
très vite
gave
enrôler
way
dans
to a
le
situation
groupe
where men are
d'extrémisme violent.
enrolled
Voilà un peu
in
comment on peut
violent extremism group.
résumer ce
So in a nutshell, this
ce
is how we
type-là
can
de
summarize
conflit, genre
this
et climat, qui
situation.
vraiment entraîne plus
And that creates more vulnerability, especially for women. So what I can say regarding that is that it would be a very good thing to have an integrated and inclusive approach that will take into account the gender in gender and climate policy and also security. This is very important to mitigate the challenges and promote a sustainable peace. This is what I can say concerning this first topic. On the practical case that we just done in the case study, Gaga case study, I would like to, first, I would like to thank the colleagues in the office, the web office, and the minister that dived into this study with the team. So I'd like to really thank them. So how did it go? I will not go back to exactly how it went down, but we selected a person, an internally displaced person. Why? Because that person fled the conflict in Burkina Faso, in the Kelbo region in the northern part of the country. And she went to the city where there's more security. And we had a discussion with this person, and there are also focus group and other gender experts. So what we can keep as information from this internally displaced person, this is a woman. She was selected by Web Burkina because Web recruited her during the training that Web gave to a community in which she came to stay. So Web discovered that this woman was a really a good fighter. She was a resilient woman, so she just took advantage of the training given by Web on the soil training and other topics on climate adaptation. And this is where she put the problem of having a land to cultivate because she needed it. So it takes me back to the issue of land. How can we continue to cultivate when we are fleeing, when you are displacing yourself? So this is the great question. So this woman was chosen among others, and then Webb also found a piece of land for her where she could cultivate, and she was able to harvest crops. So the study also allowed to note great challenges lived by the internally displaced people. And we can also note in the challenges, the gender-based violence is something that is really seen. And as I just said, this issue of land accessibility is a real problem. And also the need to set up strategies and solutions in order to welcome them so that they can continue with their lives. And there's also a need to mobilize at the community level. And this is very important. And also a support from the NGOs and other structures like WEP that in their development learn how to do other things like assistance to the people who were in need. So in terms of recommendations, I know that the people who did the studies already mentioned them, but I'd like to remind some recommendations. We recommend to the donors and philanthropic people to guarantee a direct and flexible finance for the community organization, but also women-led organizations. Strengthen
There is some noise. So, renforcer les solutions climatiques justes en matière de genre.
Strengthen strategies for women-led organizations. Plea for policy change that guarantee a just finance distribution and that guarantee the land accessibility of women, strengthen the mechanism of responsibility in order to strengthen the networks and women groups. So investment is well expected and it's very important within the framework of the resolution and the decomplexification of these nexus, because things are very hard when you are living in a such triple threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zenabou. And thank you, of course, at the very end for the call out to philanthropy and the investment case that you're making. And also thank you so much for highlighting the impact of climate, conflict, migration, gender-based violence in the work that you do and the important nexuses that need to be delved into deeper. I'm going to turn the mic over to Tynesha McHarris from the Black Feminist Fund. Welcome, Tynesha. Can you also reflect on the conflict, gender, and climate nexus in your context and what that specifically means for the Black feminist movements? And how does the Black Feminist Fund support their mobilization in the face of multiple crises? And what strategies have been most effective in strengthening resilience and resistance?
Hi, everybody. Okay, come on, do better than that. Hi, everybody, we here. There we go. I'm gonna share, you can tell I'm from New York because I'm super loud. If I'm too loud and I'm hurting people, let me know. Before I begin sharing my notes, I wanna share 3 things just for framing. First is, I often have relied on my heart to say a thing, but my heart has needed help, so I'm relying a lot on my head and my heart, which means I'm following my own notes. Here is the problem, though. I am bad at instructions, even if it's my instructions. And so if I get lost, hold grace for me. I'll find my way back, or who knows what I'll find, but I'll find something. The second is a lot of what I'll be sharing is from the brilliance and the wisdom of Black feminist movements that we are honored to be in community with my colleague and partner in this work, Hakima Abbas, who runs our movement partnerships work and is also the co-executive director, and from Nadia Ahijo, who is a philanthropic partnerships advisor on our team and has been organizing a lot of research around the poly crisis facing Black feminist movements. So a lot of what you will hear is the wisdom from them that I just have the honor of being a hopefully good messenger of. I also will say that a lot of what you'll be hearing is a part of our strategy to work in relationship to all this other good research and findings coming out around crisis and our movements to organize philanthropy, and I'll share a little bit about that in the end. The last thing I'll say for framing is some folks in the room know about the term, sometimes it feels like speaking to the choir. And so a lot of what I'll say is going to be things that you already know, but for those that are like, is this speaking to the choir? Let this be choir practice. Because sometimes we got to get our hymns right or believe in the song again. Y'all feel me? Y'all feel me? I am my grandmother's child. I need you to talk back to me and let me know you're here. Okay, let's see how these notes go. So Black women and gender expansive people have long understood that the crisis is not simply a moment of upheaval, but a persistent condition shaped by colonialism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. The interconnected crisis of war, environmental collapse, economic deprivation, and state-sanctioned violence do not unfold in isolation, but rather reinforce one another, creating an unending state of emergency for Black communities worldwide. And in this landscape, Black feminists articulate a response that moves beyond survival to the radical reimagining of justice, agency, and repair. Mainstream frameworks, and y'all know this, often treat crisis as a singular event requiring immediate response. An earthquake, a coup, a war, but Black feminists recognize that for Black women and gender expansive people, crisis is lived daily. It is found in forced displacement due to floods, in anti-trans legislation, like what's happening here all around the world and in the US, including that is focused on Black trans bodies, and in gender-based violence. The poly crisis is the interlocking of multiple systemic failures. It is not new to Black communities. It is merely an extension of what they and we have endured for centuries. The feminization of poverty, the carceral state, environmental racism, and the continued undervaluing of Black labor, including domestic and care work, have created conditions in which the very structure of a society is a crisis for Black women and gender-expansive people. Climate change and political instability only exacerbate these conditions, reinforcing cycles of harm that disproportionately impact Black communities. Our question is, who gets to decide what counts as crisis? And what is the political nature of crisis recognition? Black feminist critiques of crisis point to the ways in which media and political leaders selectively recognize suffering. The world mobilized over 120 billion in aid for Ukraine within 1 year, while the humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan, exacerbated by colonial border divisions and extractive economies, have received a fraction of that support. This is not about us being in competition. This is about acknowledging that all humanity is valuable, and we need to think of that when we think about the abundance of resources that need to flow to movements. Similarly, the crisis of Black women all around the world, like in the US, or police violence that are facing folks in Brazil, and the weaponization of rape, remain largely invisible in global conversations. These asymmetries in response reflect the racialized and gendered hierarchies, I'll say it again, the racialized and gendered hierarchies of who is deemed worthy of rescue, of who is deemed worthy of intervention, and who is deemed worthy of repair. The same mechanisms that render Black suffering invisible also erase Black agency, reducing complex struggles to simplistic narratives of victimhood, rather than acknowledging the long histories of resistance, organizing, care work, and that sustain Black communities. We are also seeing resilience as harm. Black feminists have long resisted the fetishization of Black resilience, the expectation that Black communities will continue to endure violence without demanding change. Resilience, when imposed by those in power, serves as a justification for continued harm. Black communities are expected to absorb crisis after crisis without necessary structural transformation that prevent future harm. So rather than celebrating resilience, Black feminists call for investments in repair, in community autonomy, and in self-determination forms of protection. Mutual aid networks, feminist security practices, and disaster justice frameworks, other alternatives to states' failures. Sex workers in Kenya, for example, have demonstrated this with their reflect circles. Communities already have the knowledge and the infrastructure to care for each other, but they need resources, not just the resilience. If crisis is global, so too is Black feminist resistance. Black feminists recognize that our struggles from Lebanon, where African migrants and domestic workers are abandoned in conflict zones, to Colombia, where Black women face displacement from their ancestral lands, it is all interconnected. And the same anti-rights movements fueling attacks around queer communities in Ghana and Nigeria are funding anti-gender movements everywhere, including the United States and in Europe. These connections necessitate an internationalist response rooted in solidarity, in co-learning, and collective action. So rather than relying on humanitarian and development models that prioritize Western interventions, Black feminists foreground community-led solutions that shift power and resources to the most impacted. They move beyond emergency aid to building long-term strategies that dismantle the systemic conditions creating crisis in the first place. Despite the scale of crisis facing Black communities, the funding for our organizing remains shamefully low. Billions are allocated to crisis response and inflection points, but little is invested in long-term transformation. Recovery receives only a fraction of global humanitarian funding, and repair is almost entirely absent from the funding conversation. Black feminist movements and the Black feminist funds call for a redistribution of resources that prioritizes reparative justice over reactive aid. This means funding for Black feminist organizings, land reclamation efforts, community-based safety strategies, and economic models that center Black feminists and our people. It is also recognizing an interrogation of philanthropy's complicit role in maintaining crisis conditions through extractive funding models, short-term grants, and the continued marginalization of Black feminist leadership. I'll wrap up by ending. A part of as the Black Feminist Fund that has been important for us is continue to be in meaningful relationship with movements and communities. Many folks might know that our first grant-making program is trying to be the longest grant-making program that we can, which is 8 years. I hope we get to a 10-year grant-making cycle. And we believe in organizing with Black feminists in the sector to challenge and to make sure that we can sing the same song. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tynesha. And I really heard what you were saying about how the fetishization of Black resistance and resilience, and how what we really need is the investment in reparative justice. And so thank you for that. We're going to move on to our last speaker. Come on. Welcome. Give you a chance to sit down. Roopa Hinton is the team leader of Women and Girls Strategy, Accountability and Policy team at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. FCDO has been a wonderful partner, of course, to Gaga over the last few months, and we'd love to know more about FCDO's engagement in this work, and what key lessons have you learned from the past, and what is FCDO's strategy to work at this intersection moving forward? Welcome.
Great, thank you. Oh, brilliant, you can all hear me. I'm really glad to be with you today, and I'm very sorry for being late. I was at a meeting at the UK mission with philanthropy, with government donors, saying how do we, those of us that have been in this space, have been supporting gender equality, have been supporting women's rights movements, how do we stay the course? How do we meet this moment? And it is a very important conversation for us to keep going. I feel challenged following your brilliant piece as well. So I will do my best to follow you and to be the finishing act here. So I'm very, very pleased to be here today with Gaga, with the Equality Fund, and be part of this conversation and to share my thoughts on why this work is so crucial to be at this nexus, why FCDO sees feminist organizing as crucial to driving change, the lessons from our own work and the support that we've done to date, but also then, as you've asked, looking forward and what our priorities will be. And I will try and address the elephant in the room that for many of you, maybe you're not aware, but we have announced very large ODA cuts. So I will come to that, but I think it perhaps speaks to some of your points about a revisioning of aid and a revisioning of the aid architecture and finding silver linings on how we can construct a system that works better for those who it needs to, who it should be working for in the first place. I also wanted to take a moment. I mean, none of us in this room need really to take a moment. I feel like this entire CSW is about this, but I just want to reflect on where we are at this moment in time. And I agree with you, feminist actors have been facing this for decades. But it does feel like it has ramped up, and the challenges and the battles that we have in front of us are greater than they ever have been before. We are facing a code red for women and girls, growing misogyny, threats and violence, rising authoritarianism, the backlash against the progress we made. And perhaps it is the success of the progress that has been made to date that has caused this level of counter-organizing, and we can take some credit for that. Not that I necessarily think we'd want to, as a community, take credit for what we're seeing now. It's these same voices that are undermining gender equality and gender justice that are also undermining and spreading disinformation on climate change. It's the same root actors. It's the same sets of challenges. And I think this is why, this is at the heart of the nexus between conflict, climate, and gender. Like others have explained the risks and the disadvantages and the dynamics much more effectively than I will do. But I think it's this that can be at the heart of what we as FCDO can do to meet this moment, what our position is in the system and the sector. We've been and will continue to stand up for women's rights, to be the voice that women's rights are human rights and that our commitment to gender equality is a given. We will stay the course in this space. Drawing out those links with our climate colleagues internally who are also facing these challenges around language being dropped from texts and disinformation on whether climate change is even real or not. These are shared challenges, and we can build build bridges within our own organizations to elevate gender equality and climate change, the challenges that we're facing, to the same levels. The other area that I think we as FCDO can do and have been doing is to continue standing with and by feminist movements and organizations, using our position to amplify this agenda, to champion this agenda, but also to give up our platforms, to sit with and raise up the voices of women's rights activists into spaces that perhaps they're not always able to access. So we know that the women's rights organizations and movements are leading action at this nexus. The innovations and solutions are driven by their understanding of what's driving climate change and conflict in those areas and how it's impacting on people with diverse identities. We've been increasing, as the UK, our support for feminist movements in recent years, and it is a change for us. It is a different way of working. It is a different form of engaging with and supporting civil society, and really supporting local civil society, I hope will continue to be a central tenet of what we stand up for and do as the FCDO. We recognize women's movements, feminist movements are change makers and are essential for progressive change, particularly able to bring out the intersection of issues, disability, gender identity, class, race, in dealing with these global challenges such as climate change and conflict. For this reason, our 5th National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security included a focus on climate change for the first time as a transnational threat, and also the role of women and women's organizations in improving resilience to and mitigating the effects of climate change. I also dislike the word resilience on every level, from an individual through to whatever we're talking about, because it makes it about you and how you need to respond and adapt, rather than the systems and structures that are the problem. But it is unfortunately the word of the day. We've had a growing portfolio of programs, including our flagship partnership with the Equality Fund, who I know presented earlier. I feel like you did present earlier. Yes, thank you. Oh, okay. And I think a lesson that we draw on from that is the importance of providing core, flexible, multi-year funding, investing in women's movements and women's organizations to do the things they need to do. We've also supported and worked with the Women of the South Speak Out Consortium, WASO, and there are a number of WASO fellows at CSW at the moment. And this is about helping young activists access decision-making platforms, including COP. They were at COP29, and we will be supporting their access to COP30 and their voice there. We've also really pleased that we've been able to fund and support Gaga over the last year and really work with you at that policy space, not just the funding, which I know, is small at this stage still. But it's really pushing that work at the intersection of climate, conflict, and gender. And I want to thank you for your leadership in this space. How much longer do I have? Because I feel like I'm rambling on. I've got 2 more minutes. Okay, that's fine. You've played such an important role in building the evidence base alongside the Equality Fund research and others to raise awareness of why women's rights organizations are so crucial in climate action. And it's so important that this is integrated into this evidence and experience is integrated into policies and into action. Because what we all know, everybody here knows this, despite the fact that women's movements are change makers, they get so little of the funding. Less than 1% of gender equality ODA goes to women's rights organizations and movements, and only I think you will have said this in your presentations, I'm probably repeating you, but like 0.22% of climate ODA goes to women's rights organizations. And that's also replicated in philanthropy, like the same structures that we have when we implement things as aid agencies is being replicated in philanthropy. What can we do to break those divisions and silos down? How can we push back on those things and make sure that we're not replicating these issues going forward? I'll do really quickly. I think there's a reason for this disconnect. I think we speak different languages across climate and gender justice and women's rights doesn't resonate with mitigation and adaptation and resilience. And we place a higher value on technological solutions, technical expertise than we do on the expertise that women's rights organizations, women activists at the local level bring to dealing with their own challenges. And it's this that means we don't count those things as being climate action or being part of climate finance. And that's the fundamental barrier we need to start breaking down. So I've talked a bit about the lessons that we've had. I think collectively as a community, we need to be able to tell the impact story much more effectively. We need to talk that language to those donors and those funders so they understand what this what this area of work brings and what it will help them do. Our next steps, and we launched yesterday our new special envoy for women and girls, Harriet Harman, which from it, those of you who are not from the UK, maybe it doesn't mean as much, but this was a very important moment for us in what's been a very tough couple of weeks, to have somebody of her stature standing up and speaking out on women's rights globally and saying that we're still here and we're still standing up for these issues. She launched and announced our signature initiative on women's rights organizations, which is about galvanizing funding, innovative finance, sustainable finance, bringing new donors in to the intersection of issues. And I think climate change is an area where we should be really exploring how we do this. It was already that area of work was already about understanding ODA was never going to be enough to fill the funding gaps. It was never going to be able to address the challenges that we face, and we need new partnerships and we need new allies. And I think that's even more important in the context we face with the wider cuts to the aid system that we've seen over the last 2 months. I will stop there.
Thank you so much for that, survey about what is FCDO committed to and the context that you're working in and the difficulties. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to our interactive session, which I know you've probably been talked at a lot over the last couple of days. So we kind of want to turn the tables a little bit and engage in a conversation. Nobody has to get up. The facilitators will come to the different tables. For those of you online, you're going to be part of one group, and there will be on the screen the questions. And for those of you who are at the tables, the questions are actually on your tables. There's a little piece of paper. We're going to take 15 minutes to discuss in groups the questions that are presented. And then the facilitators should assign a rapporteur to give us some of the highlights from the conversation. You'll have about 2 minutes or so to report back to the group. And we're going to sort of weave some of these conversation topics and outcomes into the discussion about how we're going to collectively move forward. So we're going to have about 15 minutes to engage in this. Facilitators, you want to go to your assigned rooms? Please also feel free to grab a snack if you'd like and something to drink.
Hello, everyone. Good morning to New York, and good day, good afternoon, good evening to where all of us are online. My name is Julia Scharinger. I'm the lead researcher for this research that we've conducted together with Berta from ZTV in Mozambique, with Zeina together in Burkina Faso, with Gaga, and with support from FCDO. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today, and it's my pleasure to also be the moderator for our online space. I feel very, very grateful to be part of this conversation and also to have Zeina and Berta with you, but also all of the other fantastic speakers. And there were a lot of points that resonated with me, especially also when it comes to Black feminist funding and movement funding and movement building across different conversations and different actions. So I want to ask you and start us on the first question. What really stood out to you, or what resonated you? Was there anything that you've heard over this past, let's say, almost an hour that made you think in new ways, or made you think in deeper ways or other ways? Was there something that surprised you, that caught your attention, that you want to keep with you? Anything where you felt a lot of resonance? So feel free to share either by raising your hand, unmuting yourself, or putting your responses in the chat, and I'll be happy to read them out as well. So Marie Baptiste is sharing the fact that only 1% of funding goes to feminist organizations was something that stood out to you. So thank you for getting us started. And I'm sure that many of us resonated with that it's maybe not a surprise, but that it really stands out as a very critical issue. I'm wondering if you would like to share anything in that regard, Marie Baptiste, or if anybody else would like to build upon that.
Hello, sorry. Yes, this is Marie Baptiste. I'm based in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, but maybe my shock is because I'm more from the global health world. So I'm just now starting to explore the climate change issue. So maybe that's why I found it very surprising, because climate change, has been talked about quite a bit the last few years, and certainly looking at the issue of women's rights, which is obviously a very long-standing issue across the world. And so that's why I found it very surprising. And speaks volume as well, and explains a lot about where we are in the world right now in terms of those discussions, in terms of whether climate change is real. I don't know. I didn't even realize that was a real discussion, but yeah. So anyway, so I've got a lot to learn. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marie Baptiste. And I think it really also speaks to what was shared earlier, that the technical aspects or infrastructure development projects get so much more attention in the space than women environmental human rights defenders work, for example, or community-based work. And I see that Deborah Sabara has joined us from Brazil as well. She's put a quick hello into the chat. And Deborah is actually another person we have worked with. We have worked with Association Gold in Brazil. Her story is also in the brochure that you find either online or that you find in the space. So it's very nice to have you here, Deborah, and feel free to also come in and say hello if you would like to share anything. Is there anybody else who was very surprised by the 1% of funding or by any other aspect that was shared today?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hello, Annabelle.
Hi, Julia. I can't manage to raise my hand for some reason, so sorry for interrupting you.
Don't worry.
But I just wanted to share about what struck me from Berta's presentation and Zenabou as well. I think they're both doing quite different things. Like Berta said, she's working more on the legal side, access to information, legal support for community women, and Zenabou is working more on agroecology, access to land. But what struck me is that it's relatively low barriers that's stopping women from contributing to environmental solutions. So it's things that women already do, like the capacity for women to work on these issues is there. It's just and with relatively little help, they can do all of this work by themselves. I think that's what struck me. So just a bit of help with access to information, or what Zenabou shared, just ensuring that they're able to have some land to work on. And once they have these small contributions, then a lot of the work can be completely done by themselves or with their community. So I think that's what struck me, that I guess is also frustrating with this 1% of funding, is that a lot of the capacity and expertise and I mean motivation and willingness is there. There's just these barriers to overcome, which they're doing in both projects. So just wanted to share that as what struck me.
Thank you very much for sharing, Annabelle. And yeah, it really resonates as well. I see that there are problems for more people to raise their hands. So I'm going to call on Nia, who has shared in the chat that you would like to share some reflections after Annabelle. And I see that Zeina also raised her hand. So first Nia, then Zeina, and anybody else who would like to jump in, feel free to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Julian. Hi, everybody. I'm Nia Miles-Jones, and I work alongside Roopa in the UK from Commonwealth Development Office, and have been really, really pleased to work with Gaga and a number of others on this work over the past few months. So really great to see where we've got to, and especially to Doria in the chat, who's from Brazil, and I was reading your case study yesterday, and it's really fascinating. Just a couple of reflections from my side. Obviously, having worked with Gaga quite closely on some of this, I think two areas where elements have really struck out for me. The first one being around cross-movement building. I think it's really stark to see the siloed approaches between social justice and climate justice movements. And I think there's space for the international community and donors to sort of step into that and ensure better alignment in some way. So I think that's something that we should be thinking about more. And there's also the need, I suppose, for, in the same vein, donors and the international community to also join up to understand where each other are working and where we can align to sort of progress joint ambitions in a more coherent and powerful way. And I think the two of them are quite aligned. So that's something I definitely will be taking away. And then the second point is slightly different, but on the national action plans on women, peace and security, as Roopa mentioned, and our NAP does mention climate. I'm absolutely not going to say it's brilliant. I think there's references in there, but it definitely could be stronger. But I do think there's opportunity there for us to share and learn from others and with others on how we've approached that, and also to try and support in focusing on that area, given it's also the 25th anniversary of UNSCR 1325 this year. I know that Georgetown Institute for WPS are doing some research on this, and I think they're due to publish that quite soon, if not already. So I think there's another opportunity for us there to support and engage with that, to bring others on board and to try and increase ambition around that space as well. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nia. And just a quick plug. So when you talk about cross sector movement building or cross movement building in general, there will be another case study from Brazil that really illuminates also how Deborah and Gold are working on that. So keep an eye out for the upcoming report as well. And with that, Zeina, over to you.
Thank you so much. No, I'm just wanting to second Annabelle when she she talked about land issue in our context and how we can collaborate with Berta, for example, for the legal aspect. And I just wanted to precise that in our context, it is more about how to fight against social norms. Because legally and in the government side, it is women has the right to own lands. But there are a lot of social norms who limit women access to land. So the work we are doing on the ground is to advocate a lot with community leaders for them to accept to give land to women. I just wanted to add that to what Annabelle has well said about how we can collaborate, share information, and promote women access to land. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zeina. And I really want to reiterate that as well. And again, also refer to the upcoming report. So I'm very pleased that on the one hand, we could share this brochure where we have also taken a bit of a more individual stories approach. Whereas in the report itself, we have many more case studies also from Burkina Faso and from Mozambique, how, for example, WEB and CTV are really working very concretely also with people and the approaches and the strategies they are using. And I feel like we are already diving in a little bit into the second and third question as well. And in the interest of time, I want to combine them a little bit and ask you about what do you think, and also what's your experience around how bilateral and philanthropic partners can better support women's rights organizations or women-led community-based organizations to really very clearly carve out the intersections of gender, conflict, and climate, and to respond to them in the way that is needed or that is showing up in the respective countries, cultures, contexts, social norms, as Zeina has shared. So feel free to share your thoughts about how it could be done, but also if you have any examples, experiences that you want to share of what is done really well already or what we can learn from, feel free to come in either by unmuting yourself, because I unfortunately also can't see any other raised hands and don't want to take any words away from you, or also feel free to message in the chat and I'll be happy to read it out.
Hey, I'm giving the 1 minute warning. Yes.
Ok, eu vou
Great,
falar.
thank you.
Sim, não tenho um exemplo exato, mas eu penso que esses parceiros
I don't
bilaterais
have an
de
exact
filantropia
example, but I
podiam
think that
melhor
these
apoiar
bilateral and
se o
philanthropic
trabalho não
partners
fosse
could
feito
better
de forma
support
isolada.
women if
Tinha que se
they stopped
identificar
working
quem são
in
os atores
silos,
ou quem são as
if we were able to
organizações
better understand who the
que
actors
trabalham
are
nesses assuntos de defesa dos
working
direitos das mulheres e
working with
juntar
women
esforços.
and work
Podiam
together.
não se espalhar em termos
So
geográficos, por
not
exemplo, aqui em
geographically
Moçambique,
spread out
são
like in
várias
Mozambique.
províncias, mas
We've got
deve
a number of
dar-se um
different
local
provinces,
onde esses
and
financiamentos ou
this
esses parceiros
funding and these
podiam olhar
partners
quem
could
são
look
os
at this,
atores
look
e
at who the actors
juntá-los a
are,
fazer trabalho de
and
complementaridade,
who works in a complementary
evitar-se
manner. And that way we'd
trabalhos
be able
isolados,
to
evitar-se,
avoid
como é que se
silo
diz,
work,
estamos
niche
a fugir
work.
aqui
We'd be able
à
to
expressão, mas não
better make use
querer
of our shared
fazer
knowledge and
nome com o
resources, and we
trabalho,
wouldn't have to
o
reinvent the
nome da
wheel.
instituição, mas o que tinha que se falar mais alto é o
What
apoio que
needs
se deve
to,
fazer para essas
what should really
mulheres.
be most
São
important
os
is the work
resultados
being done
que
and the
precisam
results
falar
that are
mais alto
being
e não uma
obtained,
instituição
and not the
local.
name of the
Talvez
institution
assim
specifically. I think looking
fosse
for
ter
what the objective
resultados
is and focusing
positivos.
on that
Obrigada.
objective and result would be far more productive.
I see everyone's really deep into conversation, which is really amazing. But we're coming towards the end of our program, so I'm going to have to ask everyone to wrap it up in the next couple of seconds. What we're going to do is ask each group to present back 1 to 2 minutes. Emphasis on the 1 to 2 minutes because we're wrapping up. Just the key highlights from what was discussed in your group. Are we ready? Yeah. Okay. Shall we start with the group online? Julia, can you give us a 1 to 2 minute highlight about what was discussed in the online group?
Hello, everybody. Sorry, I accidentally muted myself again. So we started out by discussing the 1% of funding that goes to feminist organizations. And we traveled across a number of key points from that. So that was a part that really stood out to many. However, there was also a very interesting point made that really showed how small contributions can make can have big effects. So Annabelle was referring to the work that Berta from CSW shared, how little steps around information, around being able to understand the law and use the law already can have a big impact. And we then moved on towards discussing the importance of cross-movement building, and that is not only important for actors on the ground, on the front lines or the forefront, but also for donors and the international community. And here we also ended with an insight of it's important to think about the type of funding, and this is also something that our research brought out very strongly: core funding, long-term funding, flexible funding, and to conclude with Berta's words, to also look at who works in a complementary way, what are the objectives, what are the aims, much more than looking at organizations' names, and really prioritizing the work that is being done. And with that, thank you very much also for the discussion, and over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Julia. Thank you to the online participants. We're going to move right along. Let's maybe start with this group. You want to give us a quick highlight of the topics discussed?
Thanks. So we spent a lot of our time on how donors can better support women's rights organizations, but also ended up highlighting a lot of the benefits there. So one was certainly around autonomy, so that instead of donors telling women's rights organizations what they want to do and funding them on that basis, we need to be taking the solutions that we know only women's rights organizations have, and funding them based on that. There's a lot around just improving accessibility by preparing people, women's rights organizations better to apply for funding and to manage grants. There being some training involved in that, but also simplification on the sides of grant makers. But I'm going to do a bit of summarizing to bring us back to, I think, a final point around what resonated, which was this question of, all of this resonated that we've seen today, but what is it that we can do as advocates and women and feminist grant making organizations to shift the way that big donors are working, and that maybe, as Roopa was saying, this loss of funding is a bit of an opportunity to force that change, because we know women's rights organizations can stretch money to make huge impact, and we need to break down those silos between these different areas, and maybe an approach that kind of funds the person that's going to make the change, so funds the women's rights organization rather than funding climate or crisis or development, is that way forward. And getting better at using each other's language so that we recognize that we're working in nexuses. I think, is there anything else that we need to add? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so very quickly, I think the highlights, and I will not do justice to the very important discussion we had, but it's so important to provide trainings and capacity building to feminist activists, also in areas where sometimes they are a bit forgotten, like the Francophone Africa region. Really like being able to participate meaningfully in climate policy spaces and bring their voices in. But actually, it's not about only funding like activists to go to these international spaces. It's really about continuous funding so that they can continue with their national advocacy. And that's often a huge lack of funding, actually. So that was pointed out. Then, of course, the important role of women's funds, who are such important actors in this nexus and actually often are even the only ones tackling this nexus and supporting and funding movements who are working in this intersection. The huge importance of the trust donors need to give to local organizations. Sometimes they can do miracles, even if it's not seen in an application or something. The really challenge of the silos within bilateral donors and philanthropic donors of these departments, they're not talking with each other, they're sometimes not collaborating. It's a huge lack and gap. It makes it very hard for movements to collaborate with bilateral and philanthropic donors like that, because it's just not matching the reality we're facing. The importance of cross-movement building, including political leaders and women in political leadership, and like the importance, and we've heard it, I think, all around CSW, of making a compelling case, talking about our impact of feminist movements, but how are we really going to talk about it? I think we're still all thinking about it, making the case that actually women's rights organizations are leading climate adaptation and mitigation. We need to speak the language of all these climate departments and climate finance actors, and we need to reclaim the language and spaces and really raise consciousness. And we, at the end, received a question from a multilateral fund on how we can collaborate. And I think we have many people here who are very happy to talk about that and really find ways of collaboration and really talking about the role of multilateral funds in this nexus and how we can collaborate together. So that's very quickly. Anything else? No? Okay.
Thank you, Naomi. Go ahead.
Thank you, Alison Marshall from Age International. So echoes of what others have said. We reflected on the fact that there's one estimate out there that suspects that 30 to 50% of civil society organizations could go under this year. And what does that mean for the ecosystem within which we all work? If it's withering and the enabling environment is collapsing, then that's going to impact a lot of the work of others, including, for example, the World Bank. We also talked about the silos, the fragmentation within departments, teams, and across civil society. And we asked, how can we connect our movements actually with women who are decision makers, whether that's parliamentarians or at other levels? We talked about the importance of age-inclusive approaches, where older women who often have wisdom, knowledge, and experience and power and networks are included, because we know from experience that intergenerational work is more powerful. We talked about land rights and whether we could involve communities in carbon markets as an alternative source of funding. Frida shows as an example how financing can be flexible, long-term, and without burdensome reporting requirements, which is what we want. We asked, how can we engage climate and humanitarian technical colleagues to fund this nexus of climate, gender, and conflict? And a good example was shared of the French Innovation Development Fund that takes research from feminist and women's rights across to humanitarian, and from humanitarian across to the women's rights. And so that's something we could all learn from. And we also reflected on why is it that funding isn't getting to women's rights organizations. And we thought that perhaps it's because they aren't seen as a legitimate part of humanitarian response by humanitarians. So humanitarians need to recognize women's rights organizations. Women's rights organizations need to explain their work and their impact to humanitarians. So again, it's this point of connecting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So lots of common themes. Our group was refreshingly solutions oriented. So we started out with the ODA cuts, of course, but who are those players that can step up, such as the multilateral development banks? We had an example of a couple examples of consortia building to sort of smooth the gaps between projects and programs and to keep funding flowing, as well as diverse consortia bringing specific expertise together, so the climate supporting on the gender and vice versa. We talked about the importance of grassroots organizations in national planning, whether that's adaptation, women, peace, and security, to cut through that academic and jargony language and to reach kind of scale impact. Another point on that being the importance of getting women in the room to disrupt technical conversations and to bring their own priorities and agendas. And finally, we agreed we don't like the word resilience and that issues are interlinked, from crisis to loss of income to then financial crisis, gender-based violence, et cetera. And while it may be in the interests of some, it's not in our interests as feminist movements to silo these issues. So we need to bring them back together with the support of champions within philanthropic and other funder agencies.
I've been told I have 1 minute, which I think is the problem of going last. So I'll say questions that came up. So questions that arose from our conversations. What are governments going to do to stem the issues, since we can't rely on big funders and the money that they give to civil society? So how can governments stop corporations from killing us? That's my words. This wasn't a question. Appreciation from the very concrete examples from Doria. What can we learn from that kind of concrete way of telling stories? What can we do with the mismatch of needs articulated? On the one hand, there's no money. On the other hand, we need money. Perhaps cross-movement building? How do we make bilaterals and private philanthropy stop kicking the ball to each other, recognizing private philanthropy is making money right now? How can we use what exists within our networks to support those within our networks that are at peril? So for example, if we are able to camouflage our identity, can we do that to benefit those whose identities are at risk? And how can we do much better at bringing our narratives to the mainstream so that we can build reliance, we can build allies? Thank you, Happy.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody in the different groups. I know that Naomi was taking notes. We're going to weave together all of these reflections, and they will then be reflected also in the Alliance article in April and shared back with everybody. So, okay, we're going to move on to our closing. Interest in time. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Dolan Cronin, Deputy Permanent Representative of Ireland to the United Nations, to give our closing address. Ambassador Cronin has previously served as Ambassador of Ireland to Uganda and Rwanda, as well as the Consular Director at the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. A warm welcome to you, Ambassador Cronin, and thank you for being a champion of Gaga's work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And great to see you all, and great to be part of that last discussion and to hear the great feedback that came from that. I actually came in the wrong door of this building. I was in, I think, a messenger center. They said, "You're in the messenger center." I said, "Yes, but I have a message that I'm bringing." So eventually found my way up here. And my message is very clear from the Government of Ireland. Number one, thank you for the work that you're doing day in, day out, in all of the various places that you're in all of the contexts and some difficult contexts that you're working in. The second message is that it makes a difference. We know that. That's why we're investing in it. That's why we're investing in Gaga, to be able to reach out and engage and support grassroots movements, feminist organizations, women organizations on the important interlinkages that you have been discussing between conflict, climate, between gender, which is why for us the SDGs is a very useful framework to bring out interlinkages and to enable us as bilateral and multilateral actors to get out of our boxes. We have too many silos, we have too many boxes, we have too many compartments, we have too many departments, and we have too many different ways of looking at things, from peacekeeping to peace building, climate, gender, development, humanitarian. So really, we need to work very hard. We know that at the multilateral space to try and actually bring the conversation into one place and for us to use the same language and to try and tackle the issues at the grassroots level as well, very importantly. Ireland, I think, uses whatever opportunities that we have, be it through the UN Security Council. I think we broke the record in our presidency of having the most women briefers at the Security Council. Of course, we realized during that it's great to open the space and to bring people in. We need to be careful about following up on that and not just, I think somebody said, providing funds to come to a particular summit in New York or Geneva, but what happens afterwards. Also, of course, human rights defenders quite often face reprisals on return to the places where they've worked in. So we're wanting to do a bit more work on that as well, raise awareness here in New York at the UN level in terms of that issue. Be it supporting organizations like yourselves, the UN Trust Fund for Violence Against Women, which provides a lot of funding. We have a donor meeting on that tomorrow, to grassroots organizations direct. And in our work with UN agencies, through which we give quite a substantial amount of our funding through multilateral agencies, to be able to themselves look at their localization, their ability to rely on local partners and to support grassroots organizations is very important for us as well. Now, perhaps more than ever, because as people will well realize, the funding environment is constrained. Our worry is that that funding environment is constrained at the same time that the space for civil society is being constrained, where the space for human rights and justice is being constrained. And that's a heady mix. And that's a challenge for us to be able to try and put our heads around how we shore it up, even in difficult times, how we're able to ensure that the role of the UN at the grassroots level is supported and enhanced, and how we ensure that organizations like yourselves are able to sustain the work that you're doing, to have those spaces and to use them in the best way possible. Because it's all very good to have a space or to carve out a space, and now how you use that is equally as important. You have ideas, you have great experiences. There are ways of trying to bring in that experience. Somebody spoke about reaching into older populations, for sure. The youth and how to engage with them is very important. For us, I want to say as well that Ireland is looking, here we are for CSW, of course, and it's a very busy and energetic week. We've been given the task with Botswana of CSW revitalization, which is an important task for us. So any ideas on that, very useful as well. One could argue that if it's not broken, why do you fix it? So we want to make sure that we maintain the vibrancy and the space and the voice that is brought by CSW in the UN system, and perhaps look at ways as well of improving and enhancing and making sure that that is well sustained as we go along. So there are the few remarks. I've been told to say that the funding that we have and our engagement, I know our climate director took part in the last COP in a side event by Gaga, and so for us, the report and the output that you have from this discussion will be very important. We're very much looking forward to reading that and engaging within our own system, with others, our EU partners, for example, and here at the UN and with others. And great to see the World Bank here. Thank you as well for your participation, because now more than ever, we need all hands on deck. So we're very happy to be with you in that. You can count on us, and we look forward to our further engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I like the all hands on deck ending to this. With that, we want to bid you farewell. Thank you so much to IRC for hosting us, and of course to Equality Fund, to Gaga for organizing this session, and for all of your participation and engagement this morning. And I hope you all have a really good rest of your day. Please grab some food, continue talking if you want to, but yeah, thank you so much for your engagement.